This little silver bad boy is known as denarius, a standard Roman silver coin introduced first during the Second Punic War. During the 1st century, the amount of silver in this coin amounted to more than 90%. Yet by 170 AD, the denarius was made from 75% silver, and only 60% silver by 211 AD. By 270 AD, this was finally reduced to merely 5% silver. Soon thereafter, Rome abandoned using silver in their coins altogether, switching to bronze to mint their coins. Inflation was severe as the value of the currency declined. The similar pattern might be seen not only in denarius but almost in all other coins used by ancient Romans. As now, the inflation in the US and most first world countries is reaching highest levels in decades, it would be wise to perhaps take lessons from the ancients and understand how our current monetary policy might turn out for us in the long term. Nowadays, governments issue money to serve as a means of exchange and value storage in the economy. However, the Romans minted money only for one purpose, and that is to pay their own government expenses. Before the age of coined money, governments used to pay their obligations and collect taxes in the form of goods, services, or labor. In ancient Egypt, for example, workers were paid not with money but beer and bread. However, such solution was highly inconvenient, not only because you had to store all the goods and transport them, but also it made it impossible to really have a clear budget and thus be able to clearly manage the expenses of a state. Many rulers, be it in the Middle East, Carthage, or Greece, had quickly realized that having money circulating throughout the provinces is a good thing, as it makes collecting taxes and paying your own expenses much easier. Romans have of course realized this too, but what is important to note is the fact that in all of these ancient states, the nature and the amount of minted money was always determined by the financial obligations of a state. In other words, you only minted as much money as you needed to cover your own expenses. The emperors of ancient Roman Empire had many sources of revenue. However, in almost all ancient states, taxation was the most important one. The same was true for ancient Rome. The other important sources of income were tariffs, imposed on both foreign and domestic luxury goods such as silk, jewelry, wine, or chinaware, revenue that came from goods produced directly by the government's land, workshops, or mines, and the revenue that came from the slave trade. All of this revenue, of course, was spent on something. The main Roman expenditures consisted mainly of paying the small imperial administration, sponsoring infrastructure, gladiator fights and other forms of entertainment, and subsidizing the grain from the Nile to feed the citizens of the city of Rome. However, above all, the main expenditure of the Romans was the army. The army of the Roman Empire by ancient standards was ridiculously big. By early 3rd century, Roman Empire had more than 500,000 men under arms permanently, and up to 1 million periodically when the situation turned really dire during the crisis of the 3rd century. The point is, this amount of men for ancient standards was insane. You had to feed, accommodate and pay all these soldiers, which was a difficult task. Soldiers in Rome were for most of the time paid well. On joining the Roman army in the 2nd century, recruits received the viaticum and took the oath of alliance, which was repeated each year in service. The viaticum was 75 denarii, or 3 gold pieces, and the same amount was paid to auxiliary troops. Also, at least to the time of Septimus Severus, in terms of salary, they received 3 installments of 75 denarii in January, May and September. This means that the average legionary earned about as much as a skilled craftsman in small or medium cities. Officers were paid much better. All this meant that the salary of a soldier alone was a huge expense for the empire. To be fair, other expenses were not as big since, for example, most of the equipment and food was not state subsidized, and legionaries had to buy it themselves. Nevertheless, the army was a huge expense for the Romans, and the salaries of soldiers in peak periods amounted to about a half of total payroll. Despite the fact that the imperial budget's estimates are far from accurate, we can calculate that the imperial budget amounted to something around 1 billion sestertius in the 2nd century. About 700 million sestertius was spent alone on a military. This means that Roman expenditures consisted mainly of military spending. To put it into the perspective, US military expenditure for 2020 was $778.23 billion, around 20% of a total federal budget. This, by world standards, is considered ridiculously high today, as US is a country that spends the most on military. Yet, it really isn't much compared to Rome, where up to 80% of a budget consisted of military expenditure. To fulfill such big financial obligations, Romans minted a lot of coins. To make such high-value transactions as paying the legions and store wealth, they used the golden coin, known as aureus. This big bad boy weighs around 7 grams and in theory it should consist almost entirely of gold. In practice, the amount of gold in the coin was steadily decreased, and in 3rd century, by the time of a rule of Gordian III, the amount of gold in a coin amounted to around 5 grams. However, the average Roman did not see any aureus in his entire lifetime. Instead, Romans in their daily lives used the silver coins, known as denarius, and brass coins, known as sestertius. This is up until it wasn't completely devalued in the late Roman period. For almost 2 centuries, the Roman monetary system was relatively stable. It operated based on so-called Augustan values. That is the state fixed exchange rates for coins, presented in a graph table. The problem is that even at the peak of Pax Romana, the government expenditures tended to exceed the revenue. Usually the deficit wasn't too concerning and big. Nevertheless, you had to cover it in some way. So, in what way can you cover a deficit? Well, technically, the Roman government might just borrow a little bit of money, but that would cost you something in the future, wouldn't it? So, instead, the Roman emperors had to rely on the new silver and gold deposits and the profits from wars and slave trade. But eventually, even those supplies fell short. However, some really smart guy came up with the idea. What if we simply reduce the amount of gold and silver in the coins we mint by a little bit, so that nobody noticed? Naturally, debasing the currency seemed a better option than delaying the payments of soldiers, as it would probably lead to army rebellion against the emperor. In the early years of the empire, the debasement attempts were rare. Neron, for example, slightly decreased the amount of gold in aureus, but this and all other similar changes were minor, and they did not have any major impact on the economy. However, all this would come to an end by the late 2nd century, when the empire had been struck with a series of disasters. Before we get into the events of the 3rd century, we had to examine the prior events of the second half of the 2nd century that had a major impact on the crisis. Firstly, the Antonine Plague of 165 to 180 AD claimed the lives of millions of Romans, including the Emperor Lucius Verus in 169 AD, who was co-regent with the famous Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius. These two emperors had risen to the throne by virtue of being adopted by the previous emperor, Antonius Pius, and as a result their family name, Antonius, has become associated with the pandemic. The pandemic was probably caused by the smallpox and had left the Roman Empire depopulated, as it had reduced the population of the empire by 10 to 25%. To make things even worse for the Romans, the Marcomannic Wars had begun at the same time. The Germanic tribes, sensing weakness of the Roman army, severely impacted by the plague, launched a series of invasions on the Roman frontier. This forced the Emperor Aurelius to wage a series of expensive and long campaigns in the north. Marcus managed to repel the barbarians after 14 years, but at a high cost of emptying the imperial treasure and depleting the local population from recruits. These events left the empire severely weakened for years to come. After the death of Marcus Aurelius in 100 AD, Commodus took power. Commodus' rule proved to be a disaster, as he quickly became a universally despised tyrant, and was assassinated after 12 years of terrible rule. His death, however, led to a creation of power vacuum that resulted in the so-called Year of the Five Emperors. After the Commodus died, a man by the name of Pertinax was named emperor, but immediately aroused opposition in the Praetorian Guard when he attempted to initiate reforms. They then plotted his assassination, and Pertinax was killed while trying to reason with the mutineers. So, what did the Senate do after the de facto coup d'état and the death of yet another emperor? Obviously, they put their differences aside, gathered, and peacefully elected the next emperor. I'm kidding, obviously. After Pertinax died, everybody started to kill each other. Diodius Julius bought the title of emperor from the Praetorian Guard. Obviously, it was completely illegal, and Diodius was quickly executed by the Senate, who then thrown it out to furious infighting. After a few weeks and executions, Severus was declared Caesar by the Senate, but the Pescennius Niger was hostile when he declared himself emperor. This resulted in a massive civil war. Due to this war, Severus allowed Claudius Albinus, whom he suspected of being a threat, to be a co-Caesar, so that Severus did not have to preoccupy himself with the imperial governance. This move allowed him to concentrate on waging the war against Niger. Severus managed to win and establish the Severan dynasty. However, turmoil of the late 2nd century left Rome devastated for a storm that was about to come. After the Roman Empire had been stabilized once again, after the turmoil of the Year of the Five Emperors, in the regime of Severus. However, with the dawn of the 3rd century, things started to become dire again. The army required larger and larger bribes to remain loyal. Septimus Severus raised the pay of legionaries and gave substantial donations to the troops. The large and ongoing increase in military expenditure caused problems for all of his successors. His son, Caracalla, raised the annual pay and lavished many benefits on the army in accordance with the advice of his father to keep their loyalty. Things started to become dire rather quickly. And then the disaster struck the empire in the year 235. The Emperor Severus Aleksander was assassinated by his own troops. This event symbolically began the crisis of the 3rd century, also known as the military anarchy. Rome imploded in one seemingly endless cycle of civil wars. Every frontier had been breached by the barbarians, and cities from Londinium to Antioch were pillaged. I won't get into too much detail here, as it is an incredibly complex subject, but what is important for now is that the empire needed money, a lot of money, to pay the troops. However, as one might expect, under such both external and internal pressure, Roman economy completely collapsed. This left emperors and countless usurpers with only one option, and that is to debase Roman currency and mint money at the rate that would make even the fat embarrassed. The amount of silver in Roman silver coins, such as debarius, previously relatively stable for decades, had been reduced in some of the best cases by almost 100%, while more common silver coins, such as Antoninus, had been debased into oblivion, with some coins containing less than 5% of precious metal. Aurelius' Roman golden coin, previously the most stable of Roman coins, had been debased to around 3 grams of gold by the rule of Imperial Gallienus, a 120% decrease from the time of Caracalla, at the beginning of the 3rd century, and that decrease was at best some of the surviving Aurelian coins from the 60s of the 3rd century can contain as much as 1 gram of pure gold. No matter when one will look, he will find out that practically all of the Roman coinage from the 3rd century had been debased, sometimes to a level beyond comprehension. One of the most devastating results of such debasement for Romans was inflation. In the ancient world, inflation worked more or less the same as currently. The inflation was directly correlated with the amount of money in supply in relation to goods. One of the things, however, that worked quite differently compared to today, aside from the fact that the coinage had a real foundation in precious metals, was the fact that the amount of bullion in the coinage wasn't directly correlated with inflation. Romans knew and cared about how much metal their currency contained, but if the trust in government was relatively high, then the people, relatively willing to trade their coins at an artificially high price. However, the moment the trust of the people in the government had diminished, just as in the case of the crisis of the 3rd century, coinage started to be judged purely by the amount of precious metal it had contained. Inflation in previous years in Rome had existed, of course. For example, after Augustus' conquest of Egypt, Rome was flooded with big amounts of precious metals. In the 2nd century, inflation, however, started to be the result not of the influx of new precious metals to the economy, but a sign of currency devaluation. For example, over the course of the 2nd century, the price of tunics in the city of Rome itself rose from 15 sestertii to almost 35 by the end of the 2nd century. This inflation was nothing, however, compared to hyperinflation of the 3rd century. As prices rose, more and more coinage was abandoned altogether. Sestertius fell out of production, the golden coins became a rarity, and the bronze and brass coins became essentially worthless. By the 2nd half of the 3rd century, Antoninus, a coin worth approximately 2 denarius, became the only one in common use. As the amount of silver declined rapidly, Antoninus was increasingly refused to be accepted at nominal value. To compensate, the empire did the reasonable thing and stopped minting worthless coins. Well, not really. Emperor simply minted even more coins to compensate and devaluate the currency even further. The situation got that bad that by Emperor Gallienus, Romans minted as much as million coins a day. This of course resulted in inflation going up throughout the roof, starting one of the first real hyperinflations in history. Situation became so bad, in fact, that most Roman citizens stopped using currency altogether and simply turned to barter to meet their needs. By the end of the reign of the Emperor Gallienus in the year 268, the empire effectively collapsed into 3 separate parts. Germans were sacking northern Italy, and the huge barbarian army was massing north of the Danube River. A man by the name of Marcus Aurelius Claudius Gothicus took power and miraculously defeated the invaders. He died rather quickly in 270 AD and was succeeded by Aurelian, a peasant who had become the commander of the cavalry at Naissus. Aurelian reigned for 5 years throughout the wars of the crisis, gradually restoring the empire. He defeated the Vandals, Visigoths, Palmyrene Empire, And finally, the remainder of the Gallic Empire. By late 274, the Roman Empire had been reunited into a single entity. However, Aurelian was assassinated in 275, sparking further series of competing emperors with short reigns. The situation did not stabilize until Diocletian himself, a barracks emperor, took power in 284. Diocletian tried to stabilize the Roman economy. His monetary reforms severely limited the size of devastation. However, inflation still remained a huge problem. Antonianus was replaced with a heavier and bigger coin that had its silver content of around 5% printed on the reverse. These reforms, however, had proven to be insufficient to stop the inflation. The emperor had, however, come up with a brilliant solution. What if the government had simply dictated the prices of every major good that was being traded? Diocletian thought that such a solution would bring an end to inflation, as all prices would be stable, since anyone who would sell anything at an other price than the one dictated by the government would be simply persecuted. In 301 AD, Emperor had promulgated an edict which fixed for the whole Roman Empire maximum prices of commodities, freight rates, and wages. To prevent the black market from growing, he established a death sentence for selling or buying anything at a different price than the maximum price that was dictated by the government. This solution worked for 6 months. After that, the edict became unenforceable, as everybody, including local authorities, was forced to buy and sell goods on the black market, since getting any goods at a price dictated by the government was nearly impossible or extremely difficult. The prices continued to rise, although not that dramatically as during the crisis of the 3rd century, to the last days of Western Roman Empire, and the economy limped on too. The Roman history of inflation teaches us many things, but above all, we should remember not to become blinded by the short-term gains of debasing our currency, but instead think of the devastating long-term effects of irresponsible monetary policy. We can also conclude that any attempt to artificially enforce and dictate prices is almost always doomed to fail. Sadly, as now all over the world current inflation levels reach the highest levels in decades, we can also conclude that our politicians do not learn from history. If you, however, would like to get to know something more, then please consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you for your attention. See you next time.